Hello, everybody. This is Nathan Lee at Richey May. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. We want to just get a couple housekeeping items out of the way here right off the bat. All of you are on mute. You can use the chat function in the webinar panel to submit questions or comments during the course of the webinar. We'll monitor those. We'll look at questions. If we can answer some of them throughout the webinar and at the end, we'll do so. If time doesn't permit us to get to all the questions or any of the questions, we will follow up with any of you individually that submit questions to respond to those and provide some feedback to you. A recording of the webinar is being made and will be provided to everybody that registered for the webinar. So if you registered, you'll get the recording even if you have to drop off early. As far as getting CP credit for this webinar, you do have to answer the 3 poll questions that will pop up during the course of the webinar. Those are required. So in order to get that credit, you will have to answer those 3 questions. And then we'll process those CPE certificates afterwards, and those will be sent out to you within the next several days. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce JT Gallardo, who will be our presenter for the webinar today. JT Gallardo leads our technology and cybersecurity practice here at Richey May, called Richey May Technology Solutions. He has an extensive background as an IT professional and as a cybersecurity professional, having built cyber programs for multiple companies in his career. We're pleased to have him here at Richey May and are looking forward to the advice and recommendations we get from him today on this webinar. So with that, we'll turn the time over to JT.
Thank you, Nathan, and thanks everybody for joining. Again, apologize for the late start, but again, I think you'll appreciate some of the content we have for you today. So first of all, let's have a brief description of what is cybersecurity and why does it seem so difficult? And really, a lot of people jump to the instant thought that cybersecurity is a technology problem, but truly it's a combination of people, processes, and technology working together to protect the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of the information that you need to run your business. And even more so than ever, digital content and digital access to systems is becoming more and more important and ingrained in the mortgage industry as we move forward. And the reason this seems so difficult is that in order for an attacker only has to be successful one time to compromise your systems. In order to prevent that, you have to be right 100% of the time. And that's why this seems so difficult. One of the leading researchers in the industry is actually Verizon Business. And they release a data breach report on an annual basis. And what they found is that over a quarter of the cyber attacks that occur in the United States are focused on the financial services industry. And the reality of that is the bad guys are going to where the money is. And if you look at some of the attacks that we saw in 2017, such as Equifax, the attackers purposely went after Equifax because of the type of data that they had, which were credit reports, as well as credit card numbers and bank account information for consumers across the United States. The latest insight from that breach, which the number continues to go up, they've just now stated that 145.6 million records have been compromised out of that Equifax breach. And when you start looking at what the cost of a record after a breach costs an organization, the average cost is $154. And so it's pretty easy to extrapolate that out. For Equifax, they're staring down the barrel of a $22.5 billion loss over the course of this cleanup. And it's pretty easy to see that for any mid-sized organization, that would be a pretty hard number to swallow if you were to be breached or have any kind of information loss. Another research paper that came out of the White House is from the Council of Economic Advisors. This just came out in February. They found that in 2016 that cybersecurity breaches have cost anywhere from $57 billion to $109 billion in damages. And the reason for that range is because those losses aren't always immediately realized. It happens over time, either through the costs of class action lawsuits or credit monitoring and other services that you have to provide for your consumers, as well as the breach of trust, right? An impacting incident can actually damage your reputation in the industry and lead to less consumers coming to you for services. On a global scale, the Center for Strategic and International Studies has found that cybercrime around the globe costs nearly $600 billion in annual damages. And when you start looking at these staggering amounts, and you start looking at where our economy is going and where we're going in the mortgage industry to have a more digital experience for our consumers, it's easy to see that cybersecurity really is becoming a common good. And for organizations that have lax or no cybersecurity posture at all, it puts the entire industry at risk as well as the economy. And we're seeing that in the industry when you start looking at some of the smaller title companies and realtors who continue to use personal email accounts and have very lax controls over their digital content as they interact with mortgage companies. And so when you start looking at where do these attacks come from, and we typically refer to that as the threat landscape. And if you think back to the previous slides about the people, process, and technology, the attackers are really focused on the people part of that triangle. And the reason is that it's much easier to convince a person to do something for you than it is to trick a computer. And so they do this through a number of different ways, and it could be through phishing emails, it could be connecting with you over social media, or other digital communication channels. And the reason they do that is that they can remain anonymous, and they can impersonate other organizations, making it seem as if that you're actually conducting business in a legitimate manner. And ultimately, the goal of those communications are either to have you share a password with them, install some malware or some type of software for their benefit, or even convince you to wire them funds at their bank account that could either be in the United States or offshore. When you start looking at the impacts of cybercrime against organizations and what the frequency on a daily basis is, the numbers are truly staggering. And when you start looking at some of the types of cybercrime, so malicious scans is obviously the biggest activity, and this is where the bad guys have set up automation to literally just scan the internet to find organizations that are vulnerable to attack. And the CSIS estimates that on a daily basis, 80 billion scans are conducted. As it relates to malware, and this is viruses, this is Trojan software, and more recently what we're seeing is software that's designed to hijack your computer and mine Bitcoin. 300,000 instances of that occur on a daily basis. And that's not infections, that's the bad guys writing new malware to target your organization. Likewise with phishing, where we've actually seen a huge increase in phishing, and we'll talk about that later, but 33,000 different phishing attacks are conducted on a daily basis. And without getting into all these numbers on an individual basis, this really illustrates that it's truly a numbers game. They only have to be right one time to be successful. And again, when you start looking at these numbers, being right 100% of the time can be drastically difficult. And so with that, we're going to transition into our first poll question. And the question is, was your organization negatively impacted in 2017 by a malicious cybersecurity event? And again, I'll remind you, this is Chatham House rules. We're not, sharing any of this information with anybody. It's all anonymized. But what we'd like to know is that, yes, you were directly impacted, or yes, you were indirectly impacted by a third party, such as Equifax, or maybe a downstream title company, or no, you didn't experience any cybersecurity-related incidents, or perhaps you just don't know. So we'll give everybody just a second to respond. And so here you'll see the actual results of our questions, with the majority of the individuals saying that, yes, we were either impacted or we weren't impacted by a cybersecurity event in 2017. And so it's interesting, just about a third of you guys sit in each one of those buckets. But overall, I think that's really reflective of what we're seeing in the industry as well. So moving into the first trend, is that we're seeing the increase of compliance. And for many of you, I'm sure you've heard about the New York Department of Financial Services new regulations that went into effect this year. And the goal of this regulatory requirement set out by NYDFS is to outline the minimal requirements from a process, procedures, and control perspective that an organization that's licensed in the state of New York should have in place to protect against data loss. And again, this increase in compliance overall is something we're seeing just as a response of the ongoing headlines that we've seen since 2013 with Target, that consumers are continuously being impacted and their data is being lost due to lax cybersecurity controls. So NYDFS requires that an organization develops, maintains, and monitors a holistic cybersecurity program that is overseen by senior leadership of the company. This is one of the very first compliance regulations that call that out. And so that puts management in the driver's seat of being aware of what their control framework is and what they're doing around cybersecurity. And a couple of very unique things about NYDFS is that while it only impacts lenders licensed in the state of New York that have made $5 million or more in revenue, it requires an organization to have multi-factor authentication for all remote access. And what that means is not just your VPNs, but any cloud-based applications that you're utilizing, or even web-based email, that they're looking for multi-factor authentication to be in place. It also requires encryption on all devices that house consumer non-public information. And so that includes your laptops, includes smartphones, and for many mortgage companies, what we're finding is that, if you have a BYOD or bring your own device program in place, you have to do something to enable encryption for your loan officers that have consumer data. This also includes your servers, any kind of cloud services that you're utilizing, as well as your backup tapes. And so it's a very holistic encryption requirement that New York is looking for. One of the very unique things that they're asking for is that it's actually requiring companies to name a qualified, and I'll reemphasize that, qualified Chief Information Security Officer. And what's unique is that NYDFS understands that not every organization can acquire a Chief Information Security Officer and keep them employed full-time, and so they actually allow you to outsource that to a third party. And New York's not the only one looking at instituting cybersecurity regulation. We're seeing legislation from states such as Massachusetts, as well as California on the state level that's going through the state legislature through 2018 that's very similar to NYDFS. We've also seen legislation that's proposed in New York to increase the scope of their cybersecurity program outside of licensed financial services companies. And we're seeing a number of proposed bills hit committees at the federal level as well. And for legislators that aren't focused on cybersecurity, we're seeing the state regulators get involved, and they're adopting established federal guidelines such as the FFIEC cybersecurity standard. We're seeing in the industry, the state of Mississippi, for example, coming on their annual reviews, submitting the FFIEC worksheet to our mortgage clients and asking them to fill that out. And it's a very detailed, rigorous requirement that the states are now auditing against from that perspective. And one of the outcomes of this increased compliance and regulatory requirement is the pressure and demand for cybersecurity and advanced technical talent. The demand for the typical chief information security officer has pushed salaries over $200,000, and that's nationwide, and that's an amount that most small and medium-sized companies simply can't afford. And what's even more interesting is that because of the demand and the growth in the salaries, 38% of security professionals leave for additional compensation after less than 1 year on the job, with the average tenure of cybersecurity professionals being 24 to 48 months long. And so the culmination of building a program and then maintaining the talent can become quite difficult. And we're seeing that with our clients in the space today. In addition, another compliance law that we're seeing in place is the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. And now, you may or may not have heard of this one, but it impacts any organization that retains information from residents of the European Union. And I'll reemphasize that. It's only if you're retaining information about a resident of the European Union. Now, this is a much more robust regulation because it's focused on organizations not just in the European Union, but on a global scale. And the goal of this requirement is to create a framework of controls that an organization must implement, and establishes a 72-hour disclosure requirement after a breach. Now, this is similar to what New York has done, but again, it's not just focused on one state. If you have information on a resident from the EU. Just like NYDFS, it requires encryption of consumer data. But unlike NYDFS, the penalty for non-compliance is quite unique. They look at 2% of your annual revenue up to 10 million euros. And that's a very surprising number. And many organizations in the United States are just shocked by this. And realistically, you're not alone, because many are just understanding that they are impacted by these requirements based on customers that they may be retaining financial data for or contact information for. Now, this regulation goes into effect in May on the 25th of this year. And things to remember here, though, is the 72 hours disclosure requirement after a cybersecurity incident. This is really starting to highlight the timelines from when an organization's been compromised to when they make a public disclosure. If you look at both Equifax and Intel, there was nearly anywhere from 3 to 6 months from when the incident occurred and they knew about it to when they actually came public. And these long drawn-out announcements are starting to create some other compliance and regulatory issues. For instance, the SEC just announced that they're also requiring publicly traded companies and SEC-regulated funds to make prompt notification if they've had a cybersecurity incident. The reason being is that we've seen executives from both Equifax and Intel sell shares in those companies before making disclosure. And as such, now there's both insider trading investigations going on for those organizations. And so the 72-hour requirement is really a short window to understand I've been impacted, what those impacts are, and who do I need to contact. And so having a good incident response plan in place is key to being able to hit some of these compliance objectives. The second trend that I'd like to talk about is around email fraud and ransomware. And I think everybody on the call has probably seen some example of this. And 2017, many experts referred to that as the year of ransomware, and email fraud and these types of activities are ramped up sharply in the fourth quarter and continued right into 2018. We're also seeing a change in the style of attack. So spear phishing is becoming more prevalent in the space, and spear phishing is where the attacker, instead of sending out massive amounts of emails to multiple recipients, they craft a very tailored message and send it to maybe 1 or 3 recipients to try to convince them to do something on their behalf. Many times it's wiring money to another bank account on their behalf. Researchers from the email hygiene company Proofpoint saw an 85% increase in these types of emails in the fourth quarter of 2017. And it's not just the email itself, but they're looking for malicious websites that are pinned in these emails to get you to click on and go to another website that might look legitimate. There's also a 29% increase in email fraud attempts, and that's where an email account was compromised and sending falsified emails to external targets in the fourth quarter. And we're seeing this with our clients as well. We had an organization that we worked with that uses third-party email service in the cloud. One of their executives had their password compromised, and what the attacker was doing was going through the sent items and building a roadmap of who they were going to spearfish. And during that time, they actively started sending those emails from that executive's email account, and we could actually watch the attacker delete the sent items from the mailboxes. They sent them out to try to cover their tracks. And so it's actively happening. And again, the reason being is that when you're dealing with a consumer, especially as you get closer to closing, they're excited. They want the deal to go through, and it's very easy for an attacker to convince them that, oh, hey, we've had a last-minute change. Please wire your funds to this other account instead. And so it's very important to have very clear disclosures with your consumers saying, hey, we won't change our process. Please talk to us before you wire any funds. We're seeing many organizations stop sending wiring instructions through email. But it's very important to be very clear with your consumer because after one of these incidents, if the money is wired directly overseas, the likelihood of recovering that money is pretty close to zero. If the money is wired to a U.S.-based bank, you have a 48-hour window to work with the FBI to get those funds recalled. And we've seen success in that space, but we've also seen a lot of heartbreak where once that money's gone, it's gone, and the consumer's left holding the bag. And it's interesting, as I mentioned, you start seeing clients that are experiencing an increase in this wire fraud email, and it's going from email accounts, again, from key members of the executive leadership team. And like I said, the password was lost, and because that executive used that password across multiple accounts. And what you find is the attacker logs in as that person, monitors what's going on, and then sends emails out as that either employee or executive, making it look very legitimate. So again, just some key takeaways here on how do you reduce the risk of this threat to your mortgage company. One of the recommendations that I'd make is adopting a holistic email hygiene solution. And that's a tool that you put in your environment that scrubs through the emails that come in, but also that leave your organization, looking for the content, the format, and where it's being sent or received from. There's a theme here. I keep mentioning multi-factor authentication. Office 365, for instance, has a multi-factor authentication option, and we highly recommend organizations turning that on to help reduce the risk of shared or lost passwords. We also recommend enabling what they call domain-based message authentication. It's commonly referred to as DMARC, and that sets up a specific authoritative rule set based on your email domain that helps reduce attackers from impersonating your company, which can be very dangerous to your dangerous and damaging to your company's reputation. Interesting side note: the U.S. federal government in 2017 has made DMARC a requirement for all agencies and organizations that operate under the government umbrella. And so they're seeing the value in turning this on and trying to reduce the risk of people impersonating the government as an entity as well. The last big piece that I would recommend is implementing or enhancing your cybersecurity awareness training, making employees aware of what these attacks look like, how to spot them, how to spot fraudulent emails, as well as how to educate the consumer about how your expectations will be around wiring funds and what that communication cycle will look like. Will really help reduce the risk and incidents that occur that could negatively impact you as well as your consumer. And so this transitions us into our second CPE poll question. So in the past 12 months, has your organization been impacted by a phishing or email wire fraud incident? And again, we've got multiple possible answers here. Yes for phishing, yes ransomware. And again, that's where an attacker gives you a software that encrypts your information, holds it for ransom. Yes for wire fraud, multiple incidents, or no, we run a pretty tight ship, or we don't know. So we'll give everybody a few seconds here to respond. All right, and so we've got the results in here. You should see them on your screen there. And so, surprisingly, a large number of you have experienced phishing and wire fraud. And the ransomware numbers is a little bit lower than what we've been hearing in the space. But again, very typical to what we're seeing in the trend is that they're sending phishing and wire fraud instructions. Again, to compromise your organization and defraud you of monies. All right. So going into the third trend, and this is around the cloud and cloud security. And so one of the unique things about 2017 was that we saw as an industry, both as a technology industry, but also as a mortgage industry, a significant increase in cloud migrations for companies of all different shapes and sizes. Mortgage companies are moving to the cloud for not only email, but their loan origination system, as well as starting to transition some of their other general IT systems. The two biggest gains in that space were Amazon with their AWS solution, as well as Microsoft Azure. They lead the market with nearly 70% of the market share. In the fourth quarter of 2017, Amazon AWS revenue increased by 45%. The more surprising one, and this surprised a lot of analysts, was that Microsoft achieved nearly a 98% year-over-year increase in spending over their cloud solutions. This growth, we expect this growth to continue into 2018 and into 2019 as companies are focused on reducing their costs and enabling a distributed workforce. And I highlight the reducing cost piece as we move into 2018 and some of the feedback we've been hearing in the mortgage industry around the performance of Q1. And some of the benefits of cloud computing is that not only do you have the latest and greatest software in place, for instance, with Office 365, Microsoft will keep you on the leading edge of patches and other things for your email, but it really provides flexibility around dynamically scaling your workforce. So in the traditional IT model where you buy physical hardware and you have to guess how big it has to be and how much capacity you need over the next 3 to 5 years, with the cloud, companies are realizing that they can scale up their footprint when they're busy, and they can scale it down when the organization or the market contracts. In addition to that, it provides easier access for a distributed workforce. So for many of you, you have branch offices, you have people that work from home. Utilizing the cloud enables you to be more flexible and have more solutions for them to both enable your company to be more productive, but also to provide a better solution for your customers. But with all that flexibility comes security, right? And so moving to the cloud, it reduces your risks associated with disaster recovery and business continuity, because Microsoft and Amazon, for example, have massively redundant data centers. They're replicating your data between multiple sites. So that reduces your risk there, but it increases your risk around third-party vendor management. And there's also this item called shared responsibility, where many organizations go into the cloud thinking, hey, I've reduced my security requirements, but in reality, they're still quite in the crosshairs of maintaining a good security strategy. We're also realizing that the traditional security model doesn't work, right? I don't set up my organization with a firewall between me and the internet, and all of my users are behind that and protected. In the cloud, your data is distributed across multiple services, and so that makes it very difficult to secure because the data is accessible 24/7 from anywhere at any time. And many of the vendors, including Microsoft and Amazon, they have a number of different solutions for compute and data storage, and each one of these come with different costs and performance variables. So understanding where to store your information and how to protect it is important, as well as it's key in containing the cost. And so that's really where understanding the suite of services that are available and how to configure it is key. Recently, and back on February 20th, Tesla had to make a public announcement of a cybersecurity compromise. They fell victim to cryptojacking. And again, that's where a piece of software is installed in your environment to mine Bitcoins. The bad guys are figuring out it's much more productive, instead of holding your data for ransom, just to invisibly use your computing platform to generate Bitcoin for them. And so using one of Tesla's AWS cloud environments, which was used to gather and analyze telemetry data, so that's the performance of their vehicles from an engineering perspective. So lots of data, so it's a very large computing environment with a lot of processing power that the bad guys started utilizing to generate Bitcoin. And the whole reason this occurred, that Tesla found that their team didn't properly configure their AWS container. They didn't even put a password on it. And so when you think back about some of the trends we're seeing is that the bad guys are setting up automation to scan for vulnerable solutions or vulnerable services that aren't configured appropriately. And once they find one, they don't know who it initially belongs to, but they log in and they say, oh, wow, look at this, it's Tesla. They've got a lot of CPU power that they've bought from AWS. Let's start mining Bitcoin. And their goal is to do it on the down low, because the longer they can sit there in that environment and generate that Bitcoin, the more profitable it is for them. And not only does it, look bad for Tesla, but again, Tesla's got to pay for that CPU usage too at the Amazon cloud. So the losses are really twofold. Another interesting point about configuration management is Amazon's S3 solution, and that's their storage solution for in the cloud. And we're seeing a lot of instances where organizations have misconfigured that, and they allow the entire internet to read the content that's been stored there. And even worse is that a smaller number of organizations have been found, about 7%, to have left those S3 buckets, if you would like to call them that, completely publicly writable. And so there was a recent incident where the NSA and the U.S. Army was found to be leaking sensitive information in relation to the wars in the Middle East, because they didn't properly configure their S3 buckets. And so it's very important to understand how to configure those products and how to secure them to prevent the loss of consumer data, or even proprietary information that's unique to your organization. Again, I like to highlight that many of these vendors have security tools in place to help you develop a good defense. Amazon's got Guard Duty, which monitors security threats in the cloud environment. And then Microsoft, again, they have things like Multifactor Authentication to protect remote access to Office 365, as well as their Intune product for those of you that have mobile devices, even in a BYOD situation, and enabling you to turn on things like encryption or remotely wipe the device if it's lost or stolen. So this transitions us into our third poll question, which is, are you in the cloud today, or are you planning to move to the cloud in 2018? So the first answer is yes, we're in the cloud 100%. Yes, we're using cloud-based email, such as Office 365 or G Suite. Or 2018 is the year for us to make the move, or no, we're happy with what we have, or we're not sure. So we'll give everybody just a moment here to answer the poll. So again, interesting results here. We've got almost half of you using cloud-based email, and a quarter of you completely in the cloud 100%. And with a very small fraction of you looking to make the move in 2018. Again, I think that it highlights just the trend that we're seeing in the industry, that many of you are moving to products like Office 365. And I would just, again, put re-emphasis on considering putting things like multi-factor authentication and mobile device management in your environment to help reduce your risk from a phishing and wire fraud perspective. So moving forward with our fourth trend, and this is around efficiency and enhancements. The reality is that cybersecurity is a journey. There's really no destination, and many of our clients ask us, well, how do we get from point A to point B? And it's really about the different items along that path. going into 2018, as many of you guys are aware, many mortgage companies are going to be focused on efficiency and enhancements to their cybersecurity program and their technology programs going into 2018. A survey conducted in 2017 by the Verisk Insurance Solutions found that cybersecurity insurance losses are exceeding coverages. And this is a really important thing to highlight because many of you don't even have cybersecurity insurance. 50% of financial services companies say that they do not. And when you look at, again, the incident that happened with Equifax back in 2017, they had a $1 billion policy, and they quickly surpassed that after their breach. Many organizations have no plans to acquire cybersecurity insurance. Over a quarter of you. And when you look at the organizations that do have insurance, you're significantly underinsured. Many of the policies that we review are insufficient to cover an actual cybersecurity incident, or more importantly, an operational disruption event, and that would be in the event that you had a business continuity or disaster recovery problem. You can insure against that, and many policy providers talk about that, but you have to really pay attention to the downtime number. Some of the policies I've seen state you have to be down for over 100 hours before they pay any losses. You guys can do the math. I mean, if you weren't able to operate your business for over 100 business hours, it would be pretty impactful. I would recommend that to consider the number of records that you have in your environment. How many loans did you originate? How many of those records are you retaining, both because of legal requirements, but also for personal performance monitoring? And then multiply that number by $156, right? Because that's the average potential loss. Because the average mid-market breach costs around $200,000. And so when you're looking at your insurance premiums, doing that simple back of the napkin math can help you understand if you're adequately insured or not. Because again, the goal of insurance is to reduce the risk and cost related to some sort of impact. And many of these cybersecurity insurance policies just aren't adequate for the needs of the customers that we see here in the mortgage industry. Another efficiency and enhancement item that we see come up quite a bit is, companies talking about implementing some sort of security and incident and event management solution or log monitoring solution. These solutions are very costly, and the average cost for a small SIM solution is anywhere from $50,000 to $60,000 in year one. And that doesn't include the costs related to staffing, because a SIM is only as good as you tune it. You have to program it and understand what's normal in your environment, and you have to constantly care and feed it to make it effective. It's really not something you buy and just sit on the shelf. Going into 2018, we're starting to see a trend of organizations outsourcing this type of service, and they're either going to a security operations center that monitors a SIM, but the bigger trend is going towards endpoint monitoring, especially because the distributed workforce, and that's really where the data is, right? So when an attacker is going after information, they're really looking for it on the endpoint, and so our prediction is that more organizations are going to adopt EDR, or what they call endpoint detection and response technology, on endpoints, which is going to displace traditional antivirus and these SIM solutions, because it enables your organization to get a better insight into what's actually occurring in your environment, and what's occurring on the devices that have access to your consumers' data. It just provides better coverage for monitoring the data and the activity for a distributed workforce. So as we round out the presentation, transitioning from trends, I like to talk about some best practices and common vulnerabilities that are going on, and have you take away some things that you can do to help reduce the risk for your organization, and taking some of these best practices and recommendations back to your teams that can really have a meaningful impact, and that we consider potentially, low-hanging fruit to move the needle for any organization. And the first one is patch management. This might seem pretty cliche, but it's still the most important element to any security program, because again, you interact with your data on endpoint devices, it's stored on servers, and you have to patch these devices on a periodic basis because software is not perfect. And it's not just the Microsoft products or the Apple products, but it's also the third-party software that you might have from vendors like Oracle, Adobe, Google Chrome. We work with many organizations, and what we find is that they've done a great job at patching their Windows workstations, but there's a plethora of third-party tools in the environment that haven't been patched, especially Adobe Acrobat with PDFs. And many mortgage companies, you work with PDFs on a daily basis, and so attackers can send in malicious attachments and compromise your computers if you're not patching. Looking back at the cybersecurity incidents that occurred in 2017, and it seems cliche that I'm picking on Equifax here, but the root of their breach was because they weren't patching their systems on a timely basis. And so the attackers using those automated tools discovered they weren't patched, and the cascade of events occurred right after that. Another common best practice that we're talking to clients about is configuring domain security on your organization's online identity. Your domain name is really how your customers identify with you. And so a lot of the common attacks that we're seeing focus on either spoofing email or creating a domain name that's close to your existing company's name. For instance, if you have two N's next to each other, they use an M character. Just that way it looks at quick glance that it's a legitimate domain. A quick survey of some of our mortgage clients looking to see how many were registered with DMARC, we found just shy of a third organizations have this turned on. And again, I can't highlight enough that DMARC really protects your digital identity and prevents attackers from pretending to be you or someone from your organization. The other area that we're really key to highlight is configuring an SPF record, and this is a DNS record that your IT folks can configure that identifies all known sources for email that's sent through your organization. These are real simple controls that you can put in place that really reduce your risk, both to your customers and other entities doing business with you, from an attacker pretending to be someone from your organization. Another best practice item that we like to talk about, and I've talked about throughout the presentation, is multi-factor authentication. You really should consider, even if you're not subject to one of the compliance items that we talked about, configuring multi-factor authentication for all remote access to your environment. Multi-factor is going to reduce your risk of users sharing passwords. It reduces the number of calls that your help desk gets for password resets when people are working remotely. And it also is going to reduce the ability from an attacker to compromise your platform, because it uses a combination of something you have or something you are with your account to log you in. And with many organizations having a lot of their employees with smartphones, it makes it just that much easier to implement MFA. And so with that, we'll transition into our Q&A section. So we have a question here around I believe it's advice on the SMB version 1 vulnerability that's going around from a Microsoft perspective. And we do, and from a bigger surface that I'd state is it really goes back to how are you configured within your environment, and how are you sharing resources from a Windows networking perspective, as well as making sure that you're on the latest domain configurations. The reality of it is that many organizations still have a lot of legacy support enabled, and once an attacker is in an environment like that, it's pretty hard to prevent. But knowing when those activities occur, using things like EDR, as well as having very stringent firewall rules and network segmentation, can help reduce your attack surface and the implications of an attack occurring, or if it does occur, how impactful and how long that occurs before you know about it.
I'll read this one out loud. We have a question. What are your recommendations regarding Dropbox services? Many LOs use this to share documents regarding a loan transaction.
We're seeing a lot of that, and you know, I'll answer the question in two ways. The first way is that have you established a company-wide policy around how you want to share content with third parties? And if you haven't, I would recommend getting an enterprise solution such as a Dropbox Enterprise. Sharefile.com has got an enterprise solution, as well as Microsoft. With those, once you have a corporate strategy around that, it makes it that much easier to ask all your loan officers to use that solution. And then it also gives you controls around how long that data is out there and who can access the information. But without a corporate approved strategy around that, what that does is it leaves employees to go out and kind of find their own solutions to these problems. And so they'll go use consumer Dropbox or you know, their own personal OneDrive, things of that nature. The other half of that solution is using a technology called CASB. And there are many different CASB vendors out there, but that technical solution is designed to enable you to create, if you think about it, a light switch enabling what cloud services are allowed in or out of your organization. Many next generation firewalls also have some light CASB functionality, such as Palo Alto. And you can turn this, you know, turn on and turn off certain services, as well as monitor what services are being used within your company. But really, without that kind of visibility and without a preferred strategy, your employees will resort to using consumer-grade products to resolve those issues. As a follow-up to that, spelling out CASB, it's C-A-S-B. And so that actually stands for Cloud Access Security Broker, and there's many vendors in that space and that supply varying different solutions based on size, and obviously depending on how robust the solution and how many users impacts the price of that solution and that technology. So with that, we don't have any other questions right now, and then we're at the top of the hour.
Thanks, JT. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for the webinar today. We appreciate the questions and the opportunity to present some of this information to you. Hope that you've been able to take away a tip or a recommendation or two that you can apply within your organizations. Feel free after the webinar to reach out to JT directly. His contact information is on the screen there for you. with any questions. JT will be happy to respond to you and provide any recommendations and that he might have and answer your questions. Just as a reminder, we'll also send out a recording of the webinar, so you will get that shortly. And the CP certificates for those that were seeking CP credit and filled out the poll questions, those certificates will be coming out soon as well. Again, thank you for your time, and we appreciate the opportunity, and hope that you all have a great rest of your day. Take care.